Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. I know it's been several months since I've done my last video, and I wanted to jump in here and at least get one on the board uh, to try and keep things moving along. And with that, I'm gonna talk about topics gonna be a little controversial. This isn't exactly about space law, but it has more to deal with national security space. And this is basically based on an article that appeared in the Space Review this past week on the idea of what the U.S. approach to outer space deterrence is, or I put deterrence in quotes, is, and really, some of the issues with that. But more importantly, some of the a few of the comments that were generated in that article really kind of really latched onto what I thought is probably an interesting topic. That is to say, this idea that outer space, that the idea of combat in outer space or kinetic actions in outer space or quote space war is unrealistic. And when people come up and say it's unrealistic, it's really, that really bugs me because what do they mean by unrealistic? Again, this is bring up the article here. And I'm not going to go through the article completely, but I just wanted to show you the article in here. And basically, what the author is saying is that the current approach to U.S. space strategy is to counter this buildup of ASAT weaponry or counter space weaponry both the Russian Federation and the PRC are fielding right now is probably the wrong approach. In other words, this whole idea of resilience, and that we're really setting ourselves up for a Pearl Harbor in outer space. Now, that is the whole concept of Pearl Harbor in outer space is really an analogy I've avoided for many years, but just watching what's going on and looking at the buildup that's going on and how we're approaching it, I really think that probably is a good analogy. But that really isn't the focus of this video. Again, it's this idea of one of the commenters in there basically saying that this idea of space war or a space Pearl Harbor is unrealistic. I mean, what do we mean by unrealistic? Why is it unrealistic? I mean, and thinking about that, I came to the conclusion that basically what people say when the idea of a space, combat actions in space that are going to involve kinetic weapons is unrealistic. I think what they really mean is it's unthinkable. In other words, it's so horrendous, it's so horrible that it just couldn't happen. Nobody in the right mind could do it. I mean, the PRC and the Russian Federation must understand that if they employ these weapons, it's going to cause a lot of debris in outer space and really cause a mess. So therefore, just like nuclear war, or just like the U.S. thinks nuclear war is unthinkable, there's no way they would actually use them. And I guess that the problem with that is we're doing what we call mirroring. And mirroring is basically saying the way I think, the ideas that I have, the ideology, the beliefs that I have are probably similar to what my adversary has, like the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. However, this is a huge fallacy I see with a lot in academia, with NGOs in particular, who go out and basically promote this idea of space security, is that both these states are really think the same way we do, and the U.S. does, or the West does for that matter, and that is totally not the case. So, just to give a rundown, basically what this article says, it focuses on the idea of the U.S. depending on this idea of resiliency. In other words, we can keep on our space systems are so resilient, they're so redundant that they can actually keep on taking hits. And eventually, because that, the Chinese and the Russians will just throw up their hands and say, you know what, we give up. We're not going to be able to bring it down. But again, that's mirror thinking. So this whole idea that this resilience is actually going to create deterrence is mirror thinking, because chances are the Russians and the Chinese are just going to keep on going or hit these systems at key points, or more importantly, actually create a psychological effect. And really, that is kind of the crux of, in the case of the PRC, that is the crux of their deterrence, which is more preemption than anything else. In other words, the way the Chinese philosophy would probably go is we would look, we use our kinetic ASATs to start striking a few allied Western satellites, including U.S. satellites, and it would basically either cripple the ability of the U.S. to respond in a theater of war, say in the South China Sea or Taiwan, for example, or otherwise it might just scare them so much that they're not going to deploy their assets where the ASATs can reach them, therefore make them unusable, or they might decide that to just back off and let Chinese do what they want to. In other words, the Chinese version of deterrence is basically we're going to take military action to create a political effect that basically the other side decides it's not in our best interest to escalate things, and therefore we can do what we want to do without the interference of the United States. That's it. That's hugely simplistic. So, but unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't really look at that way. They have this whole deterrence idea of mutual or shared destruction from nuclear war, and again, when talking about nuclear war, everybody thought, U.S. version was nuclear war because of MAD, mutual assured destruction. Nobody's going to do it. It's unthinkable because we'll both destroy each other. Well, that's probably true, and that was kind of the idea. I believe a Navy scientist by the name of Craven. That was his idea when he really started working on the idea of submarine launched ballistic missiles, which these missiles that were going to be the tipping point that could ensure mutually assured destruction. However, what people don't understand is the Soviet Union at that time never thought the idea that nuclear war was a zero-sum game. In other words, they thought it was winnable, with the whole goal of being, look, we have this idea of limited damage. We're going to try and go in and the idea is if a situation arises, we're going to launch our missiles. We're going to go in and we're going to destroy the U.S. first strike capability on their land-based missiles and their bombers, so that they can't retaliate against us. And then and after that, we'll basically go to the U.S. and say, look, this has got to stop before everybody gets destroyed. So that was kind of their philosophy, but specifically because of submarine launched ballistic missiles, and specifically because of the Trident D5 missile that is still based on the Ohio class submarines. That and the accuracy, which is enabled by GPS, that kind of put a real crimp in their idea of first strike and really gave them some hesitation, and was another reason why this whole idea of ASATs really came into being because of GPS. So in the case of quote space war, we have the philosophy that's being promoted by NGOs and academia that war is not a war in space, and I use that term very loosely, would be unwinnable. It is basically unthinkable because it's unwinnable. And over the years, I've heard generals say that because, in a space war, nobody wins. Well, that's wrong because, again, we're mirror thinking. We're mirroring both our philosophy, our ideals, our viewpoints on the Chinese and the Russians, who, in my opinion, basically because of the Chinese particularly because of their idea of deterrence through preemption, can probably think that a space war is winnable. In other words, they can cause enough damage to either destroy command and control capabilities, or at least create a psychological effect where the U.S. will either move its assets out of the way and make them unusable, or basically decide we can't get involved right now. We're going to suffer very catastrophic damage that we won't be able to recover from. So, in other words, a colleague several years ago, we were having a talk, and he basically told me that if the Chinese build it, they intend to use it. So again, with these first strike with these counterspace capabilities, this is something that they actually intend to use, not to have this massive Star Wars in orbit and create this big debris field, but to basically preempt the U.S. from interfering in whatever they're doing in the international arena prior to a kinetic attack, prior to a kinetic war, and within the sphere of the Earth in their region. So again, this is the whole problem with this idea of a space Pearl Harbor in the case of what the U.S. position being unrealistic, or what I really think it is unthinkable, because it is thinkable. And unfortunately, if you're really thinking about strategy, you got to think about the unthinkable, and you can't assume that your adversaries actually is going to think along the same lines as you do. I mean, specifically with the cases of the Trident D5, because from what I understand, they're probably still their accuracy is heavily reliant on GPS satellites. So those would be prior to an accident, those satellites might be targeted to disable their ability to target accurately those missiles, which would basically take a major strategic asset off the table. And who knows, I'm not saying how that would escalate, but that would basically say we could sideline those D5 missiles. Now, I'm sure at some point that, this has come across DoD's desk, and they may have backups to the accuracy issue. But again, this is the thinking, probably might be the thinking of the PRC, the PLA. This is one of the reasons we're going to get rid of GPS. Not only that, but to allow forces to, actually operate within South China Sea, Taiwan area. This is why, this idea of kinetic ASATs is not, something that's unrealistic or unthinkable and could cause us a lot of problems in the future. So, but people say, well, the space debris. And again, in the West, the issue of space debris is very, very important, is taken very high standard. And yes, it's something to be concerned about, and something we really don't want to encounter. But on the same account, we can't presume that the PRC and the Russian Federation have the same viewpoints. They may be able to say, you know what, it's either the philosophy of, we know this is going to be an issue based on our other tests, but is it better strategic advantage to actually go in and utilize these kinetic ASATs against U.S. targets or allied targets, and we'll deal with the debris problem later, because we have a more important strategic goal immediate that we want to face. So, I mean, that's something you got to think about in line of that too. So again, this idea of space, a quote space war, or can use kinetic ASATs in orbit being unrealistic or unthinkable, is inaccurate. And really, you got to think about the unthinkable. Now, the author basically talks about this, how we should change our posture and such. And he actually wrote a great book on deterrence in outer space as well. But what I want to hone in on is that this is very, just coming right off the bat and saying, you know what, the Chinese and the Russians understand how important space is. They're not going to pollute it. I think a good example of that is the Russian ASAT demonstration back in 2021, and they just went in there. They knew it was going to create problems when they clobbered that satellite, but they basically wanted to make a point that we have this capability and this capacity. And they followed up with that test a couple of days later by making an announcement through one of their media sources that they could basically take out about 20 or so GPS satellites, which incidentally are very critical for the Trident D5 missile to actually hone in, to have that really high accuracy. Not to mention other, purposes, that the national security purposes of GPS, not to mention the civilian. So again, a lot of the important thing to take away from this is, we don't look at, we look at space from the perspective that that's going to be preserved at all costs. This idea of sustainability. The PRC and the Russian Federation basically look at it as a strategic battleground, and they're going to basically do what they have to do to take away an advantage the U.S. has in order for them to perform what they have. I'm not saying a space, quote, space war is imminent, or anything like that, but I'm saying the possibility is very high. I mean, we're in a very dangerous situation right now. So what am I saying? Am I saying we should be developing our own kinetic ASATs? I'm not saying that. I'm not a policymaker. I don't know that, we want to develop that capability, or whether we will develop that capability. I'm sure we have some offensive capabilities that are in special access programs, which I have no business knowing about because it's way above my pay grade. But you got to understand that, we can't think in terms of, the idea that resilience is going to save the day. I mean, but unfortunately, everybody kind of decides that if, you're talking about something other than, resilience, you're talking about offensive weapons, and you go back to kinetic ASATs. I'm not saying that we don't need to develop a kinetic ASAT, because I do believe that, given that what the PRC has been doing with the hypersonic FOBs test they performed a couple of years ago, that an ASAT might need to be developed and deployed to actually counter that. Because in my opinion, if the best way to counter that type of weapon is to get it when it's in orbit and kill it that way. But again, that's a policy decision, and way above my pay grade, and I don't make those decisions. But anyways, that's just something I wanted to talk about, and to kind of get the ball rolling on these videos again. This is stuff that I'm working on, thinking about all the time. And if you really want to keep up on what I'm thinking about, consider subscribing to my briefing letter, the Pressy. Uh, Again, there's 4 quarterly issues plus special issues in between. This is basically where I'm putting a practical spin on space law and policy for people to understand what I think is going on in the world. Yes, this is a subscription letter. Yes, it costs money, but I put a lot of work into this. Incidentally, since this year has been a really good year for the Pressy, I've really it's gotten a lot of credibility with some interesting new subscribers, and I'm really pleased the way it's going. But again, the Pressy is something that I put a lot of effort and work into to make it as accurate as possible and as objective and non-biased as possible. And it's something that I would hope you would look at and at least take care of. I have a web address down in the links that I will actually put down there, and also I'll put the link to that article so that you can go in and read it. It's a very good article. I think you should. It's a short read, and it wouldn't hurt to look at it. Has some good footnotes to it as well, and you can look at some of the comments and see where they're coming from. Again, they're entitled to their opinion. I think everybody's entitled to their opinion. I just think in this case, the idea of quote space war or space Pearl Harbor being unrealistic, or and what I really think it is unthinkable, is not a really good way to look at it. It's an inaccurate way to look at it, because anything is possible, especially we're living in a very dangerous times geopolitically, and space is a huge area for national security activities, not to mention the way we rely on it for our economic survival and our commercial ventures as well. So anyways, I hope to try and keep more videos coming at lesser intervals. Until then, we're right in the middle of spring right now. Gorgeous weather out. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, well, you're heading towards winter. That's just the way it goes, I suppose. Again, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you next time.